So welcome to the fifth session in our weekly Prosper with Purpose webinar series. For those joining us for the first time, my name is Rasha Manna. I lead SDG Impact Jordan, which is the organizer of this webinar series. In my introduction to today's session, I'd like to take a few minutes to introduce the initiative to you. SDG Impact is an initiative of the United Nations Development Programme that aims to mobilize capital towards inclusive and responsible businesses that are solving for some of the most pressing societal challenges as defined by the Sustainable Development Goals. In reaching our goal, we're trying to solve for several gaps in the market. From a data perspective, we're looking at the lack of data and research available to investors to help them identify investment opportunities that can advance the Sustainable Development Goals. We're also looking at the lack of data to demonstrate the business case and the investment case for aligning with the SDGs. When we talk to businesses, it's very much a conversation that it makes business sense to align with the SDGs. So this isn't a conversation about what you do in terms of the SDGs as part of your CSR efforts, but this really needs to be at the heart of business models because it makes business sense. From a business perspective, we're looking at the lack of trust in impact numbers and impact reporting. And that stems from the absence of a unified framework for impact reporting or unified standards. So if you think of accounting, we have the International Financial Reporting Standards. What the UNDP is working on is creating these standards for impact reporting. And it's the lack of standards that's resulting in the increased phenomena of impact washing. We're also looking to, with businesses on how we can help them with their impact storytelling, how they measure, manage, and report on impact. From an investor perspective, we're looking at how can we get more funds to integrate or to look at the SDGs as more than just a risk framework, but to look at it as an investment framework that helps define for them what are the most scalable investment opportunities. It also defines the risks and challenges that investors need to address to cultivate an enabling environment for businesses to flourish. We're also answering the question, how do we get more funds to include impact metrics in their investment thesis? So how can we get more funds to look beyond the financial return on investment, but to really require a social and an environmental return on investment? And at the same time, by doing that, also, how do they hold their portfolio more accountable to delivering on that impact? This conversation and solving for these gaps is all the more important in light of the current pandemic, which has also showed us the importance of responsible business practices. It is also an opportune time to beyond the immediate needs, beyond the immediate crisis, and many or most companies are experiencing significant pressure on their working capital requirements because much of the world has come to a halt, of course. But beyond that, how can we use the slowdown that the pandemic has offered to really rethink how we do business? To reimagine what new norms will stay with us post-COVID, to reframe and reform our businesses in ways that they can be more resilient in the face of this crisis, but also in the face of any future crisis. And following from this resilience notion and the importance of it, we've actually designed a new program that we're launching very soon to work with businesses that are interested in embarking on a business transformation and a digital transformation so that they're more fit for dealing with the future of business. And by digital transformation, this is, of course, more than just integrating new technologies, but it also usually relates to a cultural shift. And this program is truly a collaborative effort. We're partnering with many in the local ecosystem. It's led by SDG Impact Jordan, but we're partnering with the private sector, with banks, with IFIs, DFIs, other UN agencies, and the government. And we're very excited to play, even if a small part, in the rebuild efforts. Turning back to the webinar today, the series, as many of you know, this was actually meant to be a conference that was going to be taking place in Jordan early April. And we've shifted to the webinar format for obvious reasons, and we've contextualized the conversation around the theme of resilience. Every session, we've looked at resilience from a different perspective. Today, we're going to be talking about how can we be investing for resilience. And by the way, today is also the last session in our weekly run. We do have a couple of special edition Prosper with Purpose sessions planned for this summer that we'll be announcing on social media channels and through our mailing list. So do stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, all of our talks, including today's, are available on our YouTube channel, SDG Impact Jordan. So if I can invite Laurie and Emil to turn on their videos as I introduce them. We have a very special speaker with us today, someone I'm personally very inspired by. Laurie Spengler was actually meant to be with us in Jordan for the conference last month. Laurie is an impact investor who really walks the talk, as they say, but more importantly, focuses on the walk rather than the talk. And just very briefly from her bio, Laurie is a non-executive director at the Impact Investing Institute in the UK, the CDC Group, which is the UK finance institution, and Bridges Insights. Laurie is the founder and CEO of Courageous Capital Advisors, amongst multiple other roles. And if I can turn to our moderator, we've invited a different person every week. Today we have with us Emil Kobeisi, who is the co-founder and managing partner of Silicon Badia. He's one of the ubiquitous names in Jordan's entrepreneurship ecosystem. Together, we've launched many initiatives, him and I. We launched Beyond Capital together, which is one of the fastest growing entrepreneur support organizations in Jordan. We also launched Dealmakers, which is a platform to connect entrepreneurs with VCs. And we're now collaborating on this new initiative I mentioned, Impact Jordan. So Emil, I'll hand over to you.
Listen, thank you very much, Rasha. I just want to thank you, the UNDP. I want to thank Luma, I saw Noor as well, to the fantastic team you guys have for this amazing effort. It's great to be a part of it. I'm sure I'm thanking on behalf of Laurie as well. I want to thank everybody who's joining us today. I saw some of the names. It's lovely to see some of the existing leaders in the impact investing space, as well as the up and coming talent, within the space as well. So it's really nice to see the diversity of the people that we have today. Laurie and I are both here for you guys, so please feel free to flood us with questions. We're here to really understand impact investing in this time of kind of like market transitions. And so it's really, really exciting. I'm very thankful to be sharing this with Laurie. Laurie has a special place in Jordan's heart and in my heart. She knows the country well, so don't be shy to ask her questions that are really relevant, could be hyper local in terms of relevance. But on behalf of all of us, maybe I would like to start off by saying, Laurie Kifik, how are you? How has COVID-19 impacted you? Maybe just start from there.
Thanks, Emil, and thanks to Rasha and the team. It's just a delight to be virtually connected with my friends in Jordan, and just an absolute pleasure and privilege to be with you for the next hour or so. And thanks for the opening question, Emil, because I think, like all of us, our lives have become more powerfully integrated personally and professionally. And I'm doing fine on both fronts, so thank you for that. I actually I'm speaking to you today from my mother's home in the United States, and I feel very lucky to be able to be with her. She's in the ultra high risk category, not only because of her age, but she has a pre-existing lung condition. So to be able to be with her physically and to support her at this time is just a very special gift for both of us. So thank you for asking. And I do think this notion of how we balance our lives, to me, has shifted to how we integrate our lives personally and professionally, because in part of the proximity that we are all engaging in our professional pursuits from home environments. But it also, Emil, and I think to the point of being together virtually, it's really reminded me of the power of relationships. My career has been someone who does transactions. I mean, I do impact investing transactions in my professional pursuits, but it's reminded me that this is really about relationship interaction and not transactional interactions. And I think that's just a really wonderful reminder. And maybe the last thing is that, like all of us, we're focused on the immediate, and there are sources of anxiety, there are sources of real immediate urgent need Absolutely. That are inspiring us. But I'm also challenging myself to say, what am I learning in the immediate that will influence and inform what comes next? And I think that's what we're going to dig into in our conversation.
Yeah, and I think maybe kind of, Laurie, digging straight into it, I mean, what have you learned about kind of like the relevance of the work from an impact investing space? Like, what have you learned out of all of this about impact investing? And maybe even what have you learned about your own resilience, or your thinking about resilience as it relates to all of this?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. From the field's point of view, the relevance of impact investing, I'm actually very positive about the demonstration of relevance of the principles of impact investing, the approaches, the methodologies, the fundamental values of impact investing as relevant through what I would call the 3 arcs of the pandemic response. And for me, those arcs, and we can all put different words on it, but for me, I use the notion of relief, which is meeting the immediate, urgent, largely humanitarian, but basic needs of people. Recovery, which is endeavoring to somehow restore where people were before the crisis. And then rebuild, which is really the opportunity to improve the position that we have individually at a household level, enterprise, community, national, international level, so that we can absorb what will inevitably be another crisis, let's be honest, whether it takes a different form. And most of us know, and my Jordanian friends know very well, there's often a local crisis that we're confronting of different types and stripes. So we need to be mindful of that. So how do we build a more, as Rasha said, a more resilient future at those different levels? But I would posit to you, Emil, that I'm seeing a relevance of impact investing, not just our impact structures and deals, but actually the principles underpinning impact, because we're very clearly, what are we solving for? The question we're asking always at the center of an impact investing engagement is, what are we solving for with this capital? And that, I think, is the invitation to demonstrate how we're relevant through all 3 phases of a COVID response. The only thing I would say, Emil, is I think there is a little bit of a debate in the industry. Should we be marshaling most of our energies on the rebuild, what comes next, and letting others get on with their relief and recovery? I would suggest that that's a mistake. I think that impact investing needs to be engaged, certainly at the recovery, as well as the rebuild. I think if we singularly focus on the rebuild, we will actually show that we're not relevant. Because I think what you do in the near term, as I was saying, does influence what you do in the medium to longer term.
And when we spoke the other day, just to focus on the first R, you had spoken about total cost of ownership, and maybe it's worth highlighting how those, because those to me felt like they tied the first phase to the second phase. Like we were talking at the time about the U.S., the PPP program, and how on a wider basis there was a longer, from a total cost of ownership perspective, was actually highly impactful, even though it may have just seemed to be payroll relief. There was actually a lot more to it than that. I just thought it was interesting.
I think, a couple of things. So for folks, I think if you're not familiar, and I mentioned at the beginning that I'm sitting in the United States. I'm originally from here, so as you can maybe tell by my accent, and those who know me, I'm American, but I have lived the bulk of my adult life outside of the United States. So it is a bit unusual for me to be spending this kind of concentrated time back in the US. And the US being quite hit by COVID, and Congress was scrambling, what can we do? And I think there was in the initial CARES Act response a recognition that keeping people plugged into the economic system is critically important, and certainly in the United States, because candidly, that's how people get their health care. We don't have a national health care system in the United States, so it is a private health care system. And so there was an immediate recognition by policymakers that, wait a minute here, the social, economic health cost to all of us will be far greater if we allow people to fall out of the system, even before we kind of improve the system. So this preservation notion of keeping people plugged in, I think, was a real important underpinning for the CARES Act. And then within that, Emil, specifically, yes, the Paycheck Protection Program, because most people do receive these other benefits through their employment, through some kind of employment relationship. And so I do think that was a helpful, at least even awareness, a collective beyond just the individual enterprise and what each entity is doing, but an aggregate. I will say to you though, Emil, I think the mistake that was made in the first PPP that was corrected somewhat in the second version of it was the recognition of, it's one thing to allocate a bunch of money to get out into the system, but you have to think about what are the distribution channels for how that money is distributed, particularly to the hardest hit communities and those that are less visible often to policymakers sitting in Washington, D.C. So rural Mississippi, how do you make sure the money gets there? And I think the oversight was that people neglected to realize we have a constellation of local actors In the United States, they're community banks, community development financial institutions. And some of them are not even banks, they're loan funds, they're not-for-profits, they're other organizations. Jordan has a constellation of similar local actors. So I do think the big aha was when policymakers realized we are not tapping that local infrastructure. So a friend of mine called them the capillaries, which I thought was very, you've got the bloodstream.
Great term.
And I thought it was a great term. And so if you're not using the local capillaries, you're actually not attending to the most efficient way to maintain health in the system. And I think that has been partially corrected, not fully corrected, but that was a good learning, I think, here in the United States.
Yeah, and the reason I wanted to use that example was just to show the number of layers that exist, in terms of like things to take into consideration. And maybe just taking a step back for the group overall and just taking your definition of kind of like impact investing. And then, what changes to the definition you think we're waking up to? I mean, is there a transition in the term itself or in how we think about it?
That's a really fair question. And I appreciate it. It's always important to pause and reflect, especially because my starting premise is that if I'm saying to you that I think impact investing and the principles underpinning it are even more relevant now than they were pre-COVID, we need more people to embrace and join us as actors. So I appreciate the question, Emil. Look, from a definitional point of view, I certainly refer to the GIN definition. We can all wordsmith and improve, but I think it's a clear, concise statement that impact investments are investments made with the intention to generate positive, measurable social and environmental impact alongside a financial return. So this is investment, meaning the return trip of capital is expected. You do expect the money back, so it's not one way contribution of capital. But I think at its core, it is mobilizing capital with that sense of intent to generate those positive returns socially, environmentally, developmentally. Having said that, and this goes to the second part of your question, I think what needs to change, it's already started, but I think COVID is helping us understand that we have cousins in this conversation of capital. And there's been some very good illustrations, graphic illustrations of what we would call the spectrum of capital. So the avoiding of harm, so really screening types of behaviors, to stakeholder benefit, more of ESG, kind of how you use capital, and then this contribution to solutions, more of the purposeful impact investing. We need it all. We need it all. We need all members of that family to be mobilized and marshaled and moving forward. So sometimes I use a dartboard vision in my own mind, and I think, okay, impact investing with that intentional, purposeful focus is the bullseye. That's the center of your dartboard. But we actually need more and more darts just getting on the board. And some of the ESG propositions help the capital be directed towards the dartboard. So as much as I like clarity of definitions, I also don't want to debate it, because I don't think we should be having divisions now. We actually need and we need to be aligning. And as I say, we need all the cousins in the family to be working together.
Thinking of it from all the cousins in the family, have we learned that we're leaving people out? Are people being left out inadvertently? I mean, if you were designing, if I'm sitting in a bank, or if I'm, the Social Security Corporation here in Jordan, or, somebody that wants to step forward and make a difference, if I'm thinking about designing an impact product, is there anything new that I can learn from what's happening today that, hey, we've left people out, we could have done things a little bit better? Is there anything in the design of how we move forward? And I tie that into even, using you, Laurie, as an example, right? You started this, in the middle of COVID, you start, a Courageous Capital. So I feel that, there's a transition in your state of mind as well. So just, how do those dots all connect? And what can we learn from all of this? And maybe learning a little bit more about Courageous Capital as part of that conversation, not to put you on the spot, but.
Yeah. Oh, okay. All right. Okay. That's a compound question, Emil. So I'll deconstruct the compounds of it. So look, have we left people out? Absolutely. I mean, the numbers would show we have certainly not tapped the quantum of capital that is possible to be tapped in a purposeful direction for results that can be measured in positive social and environmental and development results. I mean, there's no, so yes. Why have we, and what can we do about that? I mean, look, candidly, I think sometimes the language, that's why your question was a fair one, has been inaccessible. And I think it's sometimes full of jargon, and it puts people off, some people. And so what I have learned over many years of bringing impact investment transactions to the market is you've got to meet people where they are. And I think particularly for the larger institutional investors who have real constraints on how they're configured, how they're regulated, you've got to be cognizant of that and understand that. So as much as I'm a big champion of moving more capital, as Rasha said at the introduction, towards our inclusive and sustainable vision of a resilient society, I mean, that is my passion and my conviction. We've got to be mindful of meeting people where they are. And sometimes our approach and our language gets in the way. So that would be point one. Point two is, I think, rather than debate again, what is impact or not, I do think, especially in this COVID context, let's be clear about the solutions that our capital are trying to drive towards. What are we solving for with the capital? And I think the SDGs have been a phenomenally helpful on-ramp for having that conversation, because the language is accessible. It's easy to understand how your investment activity can be not just aligned with, but contributing towards one or more of the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'm actually using the SDGs very often in framing the conversation, and then specifically in the investment opportunity, say, look, what are we solving for here? And the reason I focus on that goes to my third point. The expectations of the capital, impact and financial expectations, should derive from the use of the capital. They shouldn't be ex ante imposed upon the capital. They should be a derivative of what you're doing, the productive engagement of that capital. So, I mean, a very easy example that's familiar with many people, a microfinance example. Delivering microfinance solutions in a rural environment, a rural MFI, their activities, their operating costs of doing business will be different than an urban MFI. I mean, we have proven this over 30 years. It's not right or wrong. There are just differences to the operating business models. But what it means then is that the cost of capital for those two MFIs, in my view, should be priced differently because of what you're solving for with those two different business models. So I think that if you really do shine a spotlight on the solution set and what the capital is endeavoring to achieve, and then, by the way, holding yourself accountable that you did achieve it, right? I mean, we've got to follow it all the way through and say, what are we doing? Then I think it helps inform, and then my whole point go to your question, I think it makes it easier for people to say, yes or no, I can do that transaction. I can participate in that deal based on where I am as an investor, what I care about, and my own operating constraints. My only ask at this moment of COVID, and we can maybe unpack this further, Emil, but my ask is that I think this whole experience, I really do believe for all of us, has reinforced the notion that business as usual won't be enough. So my ask, even recognizing people's starting point constraints, my ask is that take a look at those constraints and see where you can push a little and where there might be flex. And I can give you a specific example, Emil, if you want me to go there.
Yeah, I do, and I think it's a great idea too, because within the context of you're seeing mobilization of enormous amounts of capital. I think for some emerging markets, this volume of capital that's going to be deployed, or that is being deployed to assist in the recovery. Sometimes it's like almost like it's a generational opportunity, right? Or it could be a generational loss. I don't mean it lost in a negative sense, but we wouldn't have been able to maximize the full value of it. So absolutely. I mean, let's unpack in the context of this challenge.
Yeah, I agree. So look, also think, because you asked me what else needs to change in impact investing, and this is a good pivot to the example, job preservation is deeply impactful.
Okay.
It's just deep. Preservation is deeply impactful. And I would have said, pre-COVID, probably a lot of people in the impact investing industry wouldn't have necessarily seen that in headlights because people were pushing towards that rebuild, the future. But I think certainly now all of us recognize preservation, particularly of employment and livelihood opportunities for people, is deeply impactful. That's my starting point, which goes to my example. What we've seen is that in every country across the globe, we have to work hard and quickly to ensure that a liquidity crisis does not become a solvency crisis, or at least to mitigate the extent to which is probably the better way to say it, to mitigate the extent to which a liquidity crisis becomes a solvency crisis. So if you look through the prism then of the recovery and rebuild phases that I mentioned at the beginning, we are seeing, and I personally am working on several stabilization liquidity bridging facilities for small and growing businesses, the S of SMEs. These are the businesses that don't have existing working capital lines with banks. These are businesses that are typically served by non-bank finance organizations and others. And they are a critical component for, as I say, every local economy, no matter where we're sitting, whether it's in the US or Jordan or elsewhere. And so if you come at a stabilization liquidity facility through the recovery lens, which is right now, you've got to keep the cost of that capital very, very affordable. Because what you're doing is you're putting oxygen in people's lungs. You're giving them the chance to bridge to the other side. So that means, look, as an investor, it's going to be capital preservation. You should be looking for and be willing, in my view, to put some of your money into a recovery stabilization facility that has a very low financial return to you because you recognize the impact bridge that you are actually supporting. That would be one. And then as that capital gets distributed, the qualifying criteria also can't be business as usual. If you request 3-year audited results, asset-backed, you're never going to get there. The money will never get to the businesses we're talking about. So that's an example. By contrast, though, if you look at the rebuild, many of those businesses will be on track after their lungs are filled again with the oxygen to pick up where they were and go forward. And so a post-recovery SME facility can absolutely have some of the features that we would have seen pre-COVID, both in terms of the financial return expectations, also the impact expectations, the size and scale of dialing up. But I really do think it's important to delineate those two things, because if we don't attend to some of those recovery building blocks in a smart and honest way about what is needed by those businesses, I actually think we won't be there to help on the further rebuild. We're going to be starting over.
Who are the principal? What role do impact investors have in the relief component of it? I mean, so
recovery.
Sorry. So in the recovery component of it, and before going into the second frame, and today I'm sitting. I have to walk into my my bank's board of directors. What's the key messaging around that? I mean, do they have a role? Does that type of capital have a role? And then how do they, is the justification clear? What is global examples kind of like taught us?
I mean, I think, so I would say for people who self-identify as impact investors, which I think is the heart of your question. So people pre-COVID say, I self-identify, because there are people out there doing very impactful transactions who do not self-identify with the label of impact investors. And we want them to feel part of the community, and ultimately we need more and more of those folks. So, but if your core question is, okay, for those people going into COVID who said, look, yeah, I consider myself an impact investor, I think a couple of things. A, they need to demonstrate that their approach to investing is relevant in recovery and not only rebuild. I think there's a credibility challenge that they have for the reasons I said earlier in the conversation. So I think that's one of the reasons. You better put something to work in recovery, because you can't just sit on the sidelines and wait for others to do it and then you're there for the rebuild future. I think that's just not, I think you're not credible as an impact investor. That would be my starting point. Secondly, within that, I do think this whole area of job preservation is a very important, it's not the only one, but it's a big one. And it's so accessible because there's so many opportunities to participate. And I think impact investors can help set the table, is what I like to say. They set the terms and conditions. They help to set the table so that there's clarity about the impact objectives we're actually trying to advance, while also not overreaching on the financial return, being realistic about that. So one of the debates and one of the deals I'm working on right now, there's a debate between the institutional kind of non-impact investor who wants to they want to respond. They get SMEs, they want to be helpful, but they're bringing their pre-COVID expectation set, and they're worried about quote unquote market distortion in making the cost of capital too low. And the impact investor around the table is helping them understand, look, this is short term. This is not a permanent solution. This is a short-term bridge. Here's how we're coming at it. We're willing to take a 3% coupon, a 2.5% coupon, we're debating what it is, but a very modest coupon to make sure that the capital to the SME is affordable, and we're not giving them a debt overhang as they go into the bill. And that dynamic between a credible impact investor who's going to put in probably 1/10 of the overall capital for this deal. So their ticket size will be much more modest, but they are influencing and shaping the terms of that transaction and helping the institutional investor who's got the much bigger pot of capital, but is nervous, understandably, about doing it. So that, I think, is a real role for impact investors.
And just, so, kind of just building on that a little bit more, when we're going to phase 2, what's the role of what role can individuals play? When should an individual impact investors step in? So whether they're angels in our community, whether they're, is there a different role for at each and every phase in terms of how people should approach it, or just, how do they think about it? And to give you an idea of what I'm trying to say here, because that didn't come out very clearly, because you were talking about the other day when we were talking together, the defensive versus the offensive approach. And is there different states of minds that fit in there? Who fits in one versus the other, or is that even relevant as a concept? Like, how do people think about the
It's a great question again, and it's very fair. And I would say I wouldn't delineate it so much by the phase, but it's a further example of what I was trying to tease out about the role and the influence that you can have, the voice and the influence that you can have at each of the phases, I would say. So, but I'm glad you brought in the defensive offensive, because it is absolutely fair that if you look at an investor coming to this conversation, looking in recovery and rebuild, the larger institutional investors have exposures now. They have significant exposures, and they are worried about those active investments in the marketplace, and those investments are being affected by COVID. And so it is completely understandable. It's economically rational behavior for their first impulse to be looking through defensive lens of, okay, what's going on in my portfolio? What do the investees need? That's number one priority. I think some of the angels and individuals, certainly they have exposures as well. But what I'm seeing is that their willingness to look through the offensive lens out of the gate, even early in the recovery, there's a wider aperture. So they can, I think, be sometimes the sparks and the contributors to catalyze the conversation around some of these initiatives, some of these deals, and even do the initial work on designing. So this, one of the ones I'm working on now, it was an angel investor who came forward and said, look, I'm going to help put this deal together because time is of the essence, and then let's go shop it to the institutional investors. But we're going to do the heavy lifting here on preparing the transaction. So I do think there are roles like that. Emil, I don't think it's separate activity sets. We want people to be working towards a common solution set by sector, by geography, by stage of business. So I do think those angels can play a very powerful role there.
And is it fair for people to look wider? In a time of great pain like we're living today in COVID-19, to look wider, to look at women's, the role of, how can, to add further layers to the development conversation.
Definitely.
Even though we're hemorrhaging within the hemorrhaging is around jobs, the hemorrhaging is around this stuff. Can we continue to look at it wider, develop it wider as a general concept, or are we being greedy at this point in time?
So, absolutely right. So using that kind of, if you say offensive lens, but even in a defensive scenario, kind of combining your 2 points, Yes, a couple of examples. I do think this is the moment where we, as a community, should be requiring non-financial reporting on any entity that receives any form of government support. Anyway, we have the tools. Rasha talked at the beginning about the importance of data. We have the tools. We've been working at this for a decade or more. We know how to do it. And it doesn't mean a business has to change and become a quote unquote impact business. But I do think this is the moment where we should be demanding, and especially the policymakers should be requiring, so should investors, reporting on non-financial performance and indicators, and the impact community can be the spark for that conversation, point one. Point two, I think you're exactly right. In some of the mobilization efforts, let's make sure we think about the distribution of that money. Where is it going? And so to your point about gender, we know that women-led and women-impacted businesses were particularly constrained pre-COVID. We have the data to prove that. Again, whether it's Jordan, the US, the UK, wherever. Isn't this a chance then, while coming up with our COVID responses, to accelerate our commitments that we made pre-COVID and ensure that we actually double down on some of those impact imperatives? So I think you're spot on right. We shouldn't put those things, that's exactly why I'm saying impact investing is relevant in recovery and not only rebuild. If you put it on the shelf now, we're going to lose the opportunity. And those are two examples of where there are immediate opportunities without actually coming up with additional capital. There are government type responses, donor type responses, DFI type responses. Let's embed some of those impact convictions, principles, and tools, I would say, existing tools, into those responses. I think that's exactly right.
So it's not greedy to think climate in parallel, and to think wider, impact, kind of like mandates in parallel.
Objectives, yeah. No, I know, and I think I was in a conversation yesterday, and I do think we were talking again pre-COVID about the linkage between climate and gender. That linkage, again, we know it's there. So why wouldn't we be looking to accelerate and advance those strategic imperatives as part of our COVID response? My only caution, Emil, is that I do think in the recovery, time matters. Timeliness of decision making matters. If the recovery, these are bridging interventions for the rebuild. Speed to market is critically important. So the only caution I would say, you've got to look for the openings, absolutely embed, seek, expand, introduce some of those impact objectives and themes you were just, and we were talking about. But let's be also mindful, time is of the essence. And let's not overcomplicate some of the recovery interventions and let's not overburden, would be my only caution.
And just kind of transitioning that and really looking at it from a core Jordan perspective, looking at it within a hyper local context. Maybe one small step back in terms of what have you seen is working? Like what has impressed you? What are some lessons out there? What are some examples out there that you think people are thinking about it the right way, or that impact investors here in Jordan can kind of learn from? I mean, have you seen anything that stood out for you?
Well, one is that what I touched upon earlier in the context of the U.S. community development institutional mechanism. Look, in my time in Jordan, I loved being in Jordan. I look forward to coming back to Jordan. And one of my takeaways is an extraordinarily impressive community of professionally managed local institutions. I mean, you have professionally managed institutions at the top of the value chain as well. Obviously, there's the banks, the central bank. You've got very professionally run and managed organizations. But in addition, you have a constellation of local actors. So I would certainly say in Jordan, it's essential that the full network of domestic assets are tapped and are part of the distribution of liquidity to the local businesses across Jordan. So that would be one. I think it's really important, and learning the lesson, both in the UK and the US, who missed a step there and then had to course correct for it. They've gone back and both countries have tried to course correct, but it was not part of the initial consideration set. I think that's one. The second is, I think there's also now I've seen some really interesting steps within supply chains so the companies that are within a global supply chain, and the orders have stopped, right? That the orders have just stopped. So the revenue overnight is gone, the orders are gone. Obviously that has an impact on jobs. But there have been a couple of examples where in the garment and textile area, where the brands are not asking, they've been thinking about all their alternative uses for what we can produce here. You know, the PPE equipment. Can we actually pivot our garment manufacturing, even if it's on an interim basis, for an alternative output where there's a COVID need and response? And there have been some examples of that in Bangladesh and elsewhere where you've got the facilities, and can they be creatively redeployed? I think the other one is healthcare. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, I was going to say, I think Jordan's done a lot of that, right? I mean, it's been really interesting to see. I think there has been a global kind of like, you know, mashup and get together. And I didn't mean to cut you off, but to build onto that, like, how can a small country like Jordan, kind of like, this is a country that's highly compassionate. This is a country that's kind of like, it's always been, smacked around with every challenge imaginable and keeps finding its way, very resilient. How can it leverage all of this and, the group that's here on the call today, and really think about, how we lead in this? I mean, from a global relevance, from a local impact perspective, but also from a global relevance perspective. I mean, are there inefficiencies that you've seen in decision-making or in any, or in approaches that like, that where we can become faster and more dynamic in terms of how we mobilize?
Yeah, yes, I think absolutely. And I think Jordan, I would agree with all of the points you mentioned about Jordan. And I do think, so from a sector point of view, I think the garment and healthcare also, I mean, an extraordinary healthcare capability set, and especially in pharmaceuticals and others. And there are many people who are now saying, okay, if we come up with new therapeutic treatments as well as vaccines, who's going to make them? How are we going to get the volume? So that's the big debate right now. And I think Jordan has an incredible opportunity and role to play. So there are some sectors where I think you could really not just respond, but potentially lead. And it's not only those two, but I think those are two very obvious examples where Jordan has a competitive advantage and track record. But I think your broader point, you're getting at kind of a modality of how do we act. So those might be concrete examples of areas where we could put Jordanian assets to work, but the modalities of interaction. I do think what people are struggling with is a segmentation delineation between businesses that we're trying to stabilize, and there will be real economy, modest growth going forward, but very important modest growth, because I have a view about what growth really means in a post-COVID world, by the way. I think we should recalibrate what growth really means. Growth for resilience, I think, looks very different than growth for GDP maximization and single bottom line results. This is an opportunity to reframe that. But I do think what businesses look like for real economy stabilization businesses, what are some of the growth areas? And again, Jordan, that entrepreneurial, nimble, agile spirit, and so many of the businesses, Emil, you specifically have been involved with and support. We're seeing new modalities, ed tech, health tech, delivery mechanisms of businesses. I mean, and even, by the way, sometimes it's low tech. I'm working with a business in sub-Saharan Africa that had a great education model, but it was very nimble. And when they, in the COVID world, and it was K through 12, so it was young kids, and they pivoted to radio frequency because across Africa, bandwidth, not everybody has fast speed internet. They can't do online. I mean, that's not Jordan's issue. I'm just saying as an example, but they're a company and now they're global. They've gone global and they're based in Sierra Leone. Who would have guessed that a Sierra Leone based company has now gone global? India, Pakistan, all these countries are asking for their curriculum and the way that they're delivering it through radio frequency. So I think there are ways to have outsized reach now through, and Rasha talked about that as well, through technology and digital platforms. And Jordan, you have all of the ingredients for that. So that's the second segment of growth businesses, but through alternative delivery mechanisms that are not geographically bounded by a border. And then the third would be on pure innovation, which again, I have been incredibly impressed over the years with and Jordan has invested in innovation. You've invested in it. And so I think those are different segment responses. And I guess my caution, Emil, what I've seen where people haven't gotten it right is when they collapse those three. And they collapse them and they don't recognize that actually segmenting, going back to the solution, what we're solving for, requires a different intervention, different types of capital, different support.
But it does make sense for Jordan to go after growth opportunities, which are also impact investments within this space. And I'm going to start leading on the questions of the group because we have a lot of really, really nice questions. And I'm just going to tie in immediately to Tariq's question. Tariq Kour, Kifak Tariq, sorry, I'm not supposed to say. He's asking, what could be the typical profile of an impact investor who would consider investing in Jordan? And I think it's worth looking at it from a global context, and I think even from a local context, like how in terms of capital flow, how do we think about all of this? Who would have interest in, who should have an interest, and who should people be going after?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I wish there were a formula that I could share with you, but I'm going to take a cut at it in two ways. So the good news, I'm a positive person, is that impact investing has gained traction across the full typology of investors. So from family offices and foundations all the way to institutions, and you see that through the big institutions who have made purposeful allocations to impact all the way to the family offices. So you're not relegated in the conversation to only one typology of investor, which I think is very, very important. Having said that, which is not the not so good news, the leaders, especially at moments of nervousness and crisis, and as I said earlier, there's a legitimate anxiety for anybody who's got money in a marketplace, is that you're going to see leadership, that pioneering spirit, that willingness to act sooner and quicker, still from family office, foundation type impact investors. The institutions will follow. I'm confident they will follow, but it is harder out of the gate to get institutional investors to move into a new area, whether it's a new geography, like if they're not exposed to Jordan already, to get them to underwrite in a new geography that they can't even visit right now is a tall order. It just, again, you have to meet people where they are. So I would have thought that what Jordan, in terms of the Jordan specific question, you want to prioritize across the typologies, obviously anybody who has a current exposure to Jordan because they know the country and they'll know some of the phenomenal attributes we've been talking about in this conversation. Because anybody to get involved in a brand new place which they have never even visited is just a harder ask right now. They'll use a due diligence reason that they cannot move. So look, you're heat mapping for any Jordan. And by the way, I would say this, though, it's 1 degree of separation or 2 degrees of separation. Jordan exposure directly in their portfolio or indirectly through a partnership that they have. Because one commitment that impact investors have made to one another is that they will piggyback on a peer due diligence. So even if someone hasn't yet been to Jordan, if one of their peers has done a deal in Jordan, has money at work in Jordan, they have expressed a willingness to piggyback on that partner's due diligence. That's a great opening. So we don't need to be restricted only to those with current Jordanian exposure. It's 1 or 2 degrees of separation. So that's the typology. The second response to the question is, what's the hook? And what I have learned in lots of sell-side mandates over for many years, where I still receive more no's than yeses, but I keep at it because we know what we're trying to go for.
Oh, we all.
Exactly, we got to keep at it. Is you've got to find what grabs somebody, and there's a place-based hook, which I just alluded to. But when you don't have that, you're looking for to what end, the problem you're solving for. That's the hook. So the clearer and sharper you can be in reaching out to an investor and aligning with a problem that they want to be solving or to be seen as solving, that is the most effective pathway in. But I do think net for new deals coming to market, you're going to find the best, most receptive traction out of the gate from that family office foundational category initially of impact investors.
And maybe before going into the other questions, I'll add one more question. Like, because Todd kind of set it up for me, like what would be your recommendation of like, what would be our call to action? You mentioned the capillaries before. I mean, how do we open up these capillaries locally? So whether it's public sector, whether it's established financial institutions, whether it's corporations, or whether it's individual investors, to deliver on the promise. What would be some of your recommended call to actions, to the Jordanian ecosystem?
Yeah, I think it's for all of us, by the way,
Right.
but I'll make it specific to Jordan. But I think it's all of us, and it's true whether you are a provider of capital or a user of that capital and putting it to work, right? So I think, and that goes to your point about capillaries, right? You have those who are sources of the capital and those who are going to deploy it further into the businesses. Look, I think first of all, we all have to make a commitment that we're going to participate in recovery and rebuild. It's not a choice; it's not one or the other. So I think it's actually, and it's an explicit commitment that you're going to be participatory and relevant and contributing in both recovery and rebuild. The percentage of your allocation, the percentage of your emphasis may shift depending upon the nature of your resources and your institutional organizational structure, but I do think there's a commitment there. And everybody has to put some allocation into the recovery and not just wait for others to do it and then stand on their shoulders and participate in the rebuild. That's a commitment I feel strongly about. I think in the recovery, you have to, if you are the investor, the source of the capital, whether it's sovereign or quasi-sovereign or private capital, I do think you have to be willing to modify your investment requirements to make it useful in recovery. If the oxygen tank is not filled with oxygen, it's not useful. You can't breathe. So I do think you have to be pushing yourself, whoever, if you're saying you're going to make that commitment, that your investment requirements have to match the need. I think it does mean that you have to also modify your financial return expectations for that recovery. I am saying it is investment. I still believe it's return trip of capital. There's a place for grants, and we should absolutely, it's and, not or. We do need grant support, and we can talk about how to use that most efficiently and effectively. But I do think there is return trip of capital opportunity in recovery. But I do think there has to be a modesty, an appropriateness, a reasonableness to the financial return expectations for recovery specifically. On rebuild, I think that you should be looking for the criteria of resilience. And for me, resilience is about building in that absorptive capacity to withstand another crisis, not of this level perhaps, but another crisis, because we will have these, all of these. And then the last thing I would say is goes to your point, Emil, about efficient decision-making. If you want to be relevant, you also have to, especially in recovery, be willing to not just do your business as usual, 300 pages of due diligence questions, 5 IC meetings, 6-month period. You have to be willing to adapt. You used a term, Emil, earlier in a conversation with me about frictionless decision-making, which I love. I think that's a great word and a great concept. And triage. Triage, not every, everybody's been at this for a while. We all have the ability to triage and then calibrate our decision-making process for the opportunity set in front of us.
I think it's a brilliant, it's a brilliant call to action. I think it's really, really clear. I think it makes a lot of sense. I'm actually going to dig into the questions now, but before I do, I just want to give you, because I love the story of your husband challenging the name of your company. So I
just answer that question.
Yeah. With the group, all about courageous capital, which I mean, it just, to me, you've always been somebody that's been in the heart of disruption, and it to me just felt like you were disrupting something. So as I sort through this, I would love you telling everybody what courageous capital is all about.
Oh, well, thanks, Emil. Look, as I alluded to, my life's work has been to try to mobilize financial resources for positive impact. I mean, that's my life's work. My father was an entrepreneur. He had a small business, and so I saw the power of entrepreneurship as a child. And I've pursued that goal in different ways. And most recently, I had built up the business at Include Capital, which is really one of the few sell-side intermediaries in impact, and that business was sold to Palladium and now renamed Palladium Impact Capital. And I remain a friend of the firm and certainly want them to do extraordinary things going forward. But for me, it was appropriate that I really transition and kind of go back to my entrepreneurial roots, if you will. And so keeping that problem set, what am I solving for front and center, which is to mobilize capital. And I think for me, I just wanted to go deeper. I wanted to go really deeper and hunt for those opportunities that have outsized impact potential. So it's a narrower set of activities, but trying to really go deeper. And I think if there's a source of, I'm a very optimistic person, as I mentioned, but if there's a source of frustration, it's the gap between talk and action. And so that is why I named it Courageous Capital Advisors, because I am purposely trying to heat map, including to myself, where we are pushing or converting, I would say, talk into action. And when you really challenge yourself to do it, you do go outside your comfort zone, even personally. At this moment in time, with a lot of uncertainty in the world around us, I am out there myself individually, pushing myself and pushing the envelope and trying to find like-minded partners and allies and friends and hopefully investors that are willing to pursue that pursuit.
Well, you have about 45 friends with us here today, so you're off to a great start, and your heart tells you where to go, and I think it's telling you to go in the right place, and I think everybody feels a little bit of that. I'm going to go straight to Sarah's questions. Sarah is asking a question that's very close to your heart. How much impact investment focus is currently on investing in women-owned businesses as a contribution towards the economic resilience of women across the globe, SDG 5? And how could this change following COVID-19 towards investing in more women-owned businesses? I know how personal this is for you, so I'll yield to you. Yeah,
not enough, Sarah. That's the short, and not enough, so that for sure. And there's been, I would say that the past 2 years in particular, there was kind of a growing call to action about gender lens investing. And I think, which was great, that there was a broader awareness. I think the challenge sometimes with gender lens investing conversations is that gender features everywhere, right? I mean, gender is ubiquitous. And so sometimes investors have a hard time getting their arms around it as an investment strategy. So am I looking at it through the ownership of the business, the leadership of the business, women as consumers, women as employees, women around the board table? What is the hook, the angle for my investment strategy where gender features prominently? I think we've come a long way in that regard. But not enough, Sarah. I do believe that COVID-19, if we are explicit and proactive and really building, Emil, on your good points earlier, where are the lever points? I do think that this is an acceleration moment, Sarah, for a focus on an application of gender lens investing across the board, and not relegated to just one allocation, one silo, but actually to permeate a much broader universe of investment opportunities. If people are not clued into some of a series of webinars and kind of thought leadership communications, it's the Gender Smart Investment Summit, GSIS. Like our Jordanian summit, it was going to be an in-person meeting earlier in April. Obviously that has pivoted. And so they're doing a series of online sessions and then some information being shared. And so I do feel, I participated last week on the kickoff, there's a lot of awareness and energy, but we have to make it explicit. If we don't make it explicit, if we don't connect the dots, I do believe that we will go back and not forward in advancing. And the bottom line is, women were capital constrained before COVID. They are even more capital constrained during COVID. So this is our opportunity to hopefully accelerate gender strategies in COVID responses.
And Sharif takes us one level higher in terms of like looking at this from a kind of like a risk of humanity perspective. And within the impact investing space, how much do you think the post-COVID reality has drawn attention to the impending climate risk and therefore the need opportunity for shifting investment to tackle the significant risks for humanity? I mean, are we learning a bigger lesson here? And are we going to, is this a wider call for all of us? I think.
I'm so glad this question came in. Absolutely, it is an opportunity. But I would say similarly to gender, I think it's up to those of us who see it as an imperative to make the case and make it explicit. We cannot just assume that it is because it's implicit and that people see it. And I think the reason is not so much that there's an active resistance. I mean, you're always going to have pockets of it, But I think what ends up happening with urgency and with people being quite nervous in the immediate aftermath of COVID, I think sometimes there's a tendency to say, well, these other things are nice to haves, not must haves. And we'll get to that when we have, when we're back on our feet. And the question, of course, recognizes, and I certainly agree with this, that that is not the way it works. This is not a sequencing. And if we don't attend to those broader questions, the more fundamental questions, we won't be here in the rebuild in a way that advances the resilient future that we'd like. So she's absolutely right. We've got to do this now, but I would just implore people, and maybe add that to the call to action, Emil, that we've got to be connecting dots and making sure that the broader imperatives, the fundamental pillars that contribute to that resilient future, are attended to now and not put as second priorities for a sequential approach. That won't work.
And I think from a messaging perspective, by the way, this is a place where Jordan can lead. I mean, just, it's small countries that can, balance those two equations out, because, we've been great at kind of responding. Well, we've been great at, I'm Jordanian, I'm biased, but we've been great at kind of responding. I just want to take Martez's
I fully agree with that. I fully agree with that, Emil. I really do.
And Martez likes growth for resilience, and he'd love for you to explain it a little bit more.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So I like all of us, I think, have been noodling on and thinking about what does the future hold? Not that I have any of the answers, but I certainly know what we don't want. And that's not to have the ability to absorb crises going forward. And as I thought about, for me, what the definition of resilience could be, I've used that term absorptive capacity to handle adversity going forward. And I think of this notion of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but you're still one net ahead. Whereas I think oftentimes what we've experienced, because we've been so singularly commercial maximizing in our behaviors as a society, is that when a crisis hits, what we try to do is get back to, we try to just restore the status quo. We restore where we were before. And that is not going to get us to where we need to be. So I do believe the goal has to be building in that absorptive capacity. And it's not just excess capacity. So you've got, the flex, but it's an agility to the business model. But there is some, if you will, excess surplus elasticity in the business model to absorb a challenge, an external challenge. And so the reason I say growth and resilience, I think if that's what you're building towards, I think it does have implications, not just on your product or service, but it does have implications on the way you manage the business,
right?
Including the return, the financial return that business may yield. You would not maximize dividend distribution to the extreme. You're going to have reserves, if you will, in that business. You're going to be investing some of those reserves for greater resilience. And I heard an interesting comment this morning from Paul Pullman on a Financial Times conversation about what is GDP. I mean, it really is. It is not necessarily it was never intended to be the single definition of growth for countries. It's been used that way, but it actually understates what we mean by a resilient growth future. And so I do think we have to redefine what growth looks like. And I think there's an opportunity to do that. And I think it's a really positive chance, because I think it will inform what financial return expectations people have. So hopefully that gives a little bit more of a feel of what I'm talking about.
Absolutely. And one of our experiences with our own portfolio has been investing in team, how much that's paid off in resilience as well, in terms of being able to cope, with the situation now, that having the right players, having invested in their development and growth, and kind of like independence and ability to, it's just it has been transformative for our companies.
Yeah.
For those that
exactly. Exactly.
They've just brains of their own as operations and been able to adjust and grow. Tamara Abdijab, my smile will say it all, asks, how do we bring together impact first investors with return first of investors? How does COVID-19 represent an opportunity for the two to somehow merge?
That is such a good question. Oh, and I love mergers of all kinds. So we got to figure it out. And she's absolutely right. I mean, if we are going to make any substantial progress at the macro level, let alone the market level, we have to combine the capabilities and the financial resources of both those cohorts. It can't be one or the other. So I fully agree with the hypothesis of the question. I would say my best experience on forging some of those mergers.
I froze. Rasha?
Is politics of recovery. I call business stabilization facility, and you can really define. Oh, can you? Am I okay, Neil?
Yeah, I froze for a second. I thought from my side. I apologize.
Nope,
Yeah,
no worries.
I just thought we're okay.
Yeah. We had a COVID moment there on our virtual connection. So my recommendation is you definitely in the context of recovery. And the impact principles can help to define what we mean by recovery to bridge to something else. And I do think the financial first investors have to be credible and relevant. They've got to put some money to work in recovery and not wait for the future. So that would be one. And then the second, I would say on a rebuild and aggregated, there are lots of deals that are being structured and brought to market. Actually, an impact first investor can help to articulate the impact objectives of that transaction in a way that the financial first investor may be receptive to, but doesn't understand. I mean, what's the language and what are the measurement management tools for monetizing the impact? That's the special sauce and the capability that the impact first. You have to be relevant to each other, even around the same table. And I do think that's where impact first investors can be fantastically catalytic.
Martin had a question, and we put that as answer live here. Martin Olson, and maybe I might be a bit, just to give you just quick insights. Jordan's an absolute champion in the water and wastewater sector, as well as in hosting refugees, Palestine, Iraq, Yemen, and Syria. He would be interested to know how to design an impact investment project in both sectors, obviously interlinked. How do you, any ideas for him in terms of how to, like from a product design perspective, how to approach maybe step one, step two, step three, interlinking water and wastewater with refugees, if you've seen anything or any recommendations you have?
Yeah, so I know I've said this 3 times, but for me, very powerful, very important. I do think, and I know it sometimes sounds simple, but I think it is so critically important to start with what is the product, the service, the intervention, the delivery that I am actually needing capital for? Because, and the reason especially in what you're talking about, which is so important, when you turn around to introduce an investor to it, they are going to come into your deal, especially with giving your thematic areas of focus, with the clarity of what their money is helping to achieve. So being crystal clear on what change, what delta, what result you are expecting from the capital, it does 2 things. It creates that alignment with what you're endeavoring to do and the investor's ability to support it. But also, as I said earlier, it will define the cost of capital. Because what I get concerned about is that even when people get excited, go, oh my gosh, water treatment, refugees, I definitely want to do something helpful here. The next question is, and I need a 10% IRR, or I need a 15% IRR. And that's not where you want the conversation to go. You just don't. You want it to be that you're bringing to the investor the solution with the clarity of the impact delta, what you expect to happen on the ground and how you're going to track for it and how you're going to monitor it and all the good things and why your delivery mechanism is strong, capable, solid. The cost of capital you need to deliver on that, that's the way to present it. And that's what you need. And whether it's debt or equity, I mean, just being super clear. I would say generally on something with that thematic, if there's a fixed income instrument that you can, even if it's a very low yielding fixed income instrument, so debt, as opposed to equity, I think you will have initial, I'm just generalizing here, but to be responsive, more traction out of the gate, because equity A is just a higher bar and people get very nervous about, well, how am I going to get it back? Remember, return trip of capital. This is investment, not grant. It's a net, you got to show the return trip of capital. Debt instruments have a clearer pathway, even with a lower coupon associated with it. So those would be a couple of thoughts.
And just to build on structure very quickly, Jenny, who with Tamara is actually has built, or I won't talk about it, for them to talk about, but building a very, very special product focused on women, is asking, do you think the case for alternative investment structures such as revenue-based finance is stronger in a COVID world? Second question, she asked for 2 questions. We'll give her 2 questions because Jenny's awesome. Around redesigning investment returns for an ESG investor with an emphasis on the S in ESG. What are your thoughts on how we build more rigor around the social component, i.e. how do we avoid social washing? And I'm a bit conscious of time. Should I ignore time, Rasha? Okay. Rasha will tell us whether we should ignore time, but go ahead. I don't want to.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. 2 great questions. Gosh, the questions are fantastic. On alternative structures, yes, but for a limited universe of investors, sadly. So the big institutional investors, even though they'll get it and they'll intellectually say to you when we put them forward, absolutely makes sense, but we've never done one before. I mean, even open-ended vehicles versus closed-end vehicles, but we've never done one before. And unfortunately, that defensive lens, the tolerance for what's new, what I can do new at this moment in time from the institutional investors, I'm not seeing at the moment a wide opening of that. So what they're trying to use familiar things and familiar ways, but to achieve COVID-linked results. That's on the institutional part of our spectrum. With the family offices, private investors, and some of the foundations, I am seeing greater receptivity, and because now actually several have done them. So again, they've got some track record and experience. So yes, but it does depend which universe and category of investor you're targeting. On the ESG, absolutely right. What's interesting in the US, at least with the institutional investors, there is a good conversation going on right now that ESG and ESG aligned portfolios have performed better through COVID than those that are not ESG, which is creating a lot of momentum and interest and excitement. Oh, we should be dialing up ESG. Remember, we need all cousins around the table. So I definitely am, ESG is an important cousin, a first cousin, I would say, to impact investing. And I would say the conversation is moving exactly where you just said, well, wait a minute, this S is super important here. We kind of got a handle on the E, we understand the G, but this S is super important. And I think SASB and others, they're starting to put some indicators out there. So I think and they're turning to people like the Impact Management Project for guidance. So there's a managed network that IMP leads, the Impact Management Project, and they are absolutely feeding in to this very conversation. So I'm quite keen, and I'm quite positive we're going to see some good developments, strengthening the S, not diluting the S, but strengthening it.
Great. So Rasha gave us 5 more minutes. So I'm going to try to get in definitely 1 question, but maybe 2 if I can. We have from Khalid Al-Wazani. In the latest investment and trade task force of the G20, it was clear that FDI is expected to decline in 2020 by at least 30% due to COVID-19. Do you still think that our part of the world will still have a good chance to attract some of the still available 70% or so? Which areas or sectors are most lucrative in today's world? And this is from if you're designing an investment promotion approach for Jordan, how would one rationalize all of this as maybe a kind of like frame of reference for you?
Yeah, again, a great question. I mean, yes, I'm certainly cut from the positive, the glass is half full, not half empty. So that 70%, can we make sure we get some of that to Jordan? Yes, and lots of us have to work hard to ensure that it happens. I do think in the broader kind of just the sources of capital, I do think that the DFIs, the development finance institutions, and you've got some strong players, the EBRD and IFC are there in Jordan now. I think they're critically important, just critically important. So I think ensuring that they maintain a focus on Jordan, that they actually are doing more, not just stabilizing their current portfolios, but doing more. And I know the EBRD made a very big announcement a week ago, IFC similarly, but making sure Jordan is part of that conversation and you can demonstrate how those DFIs are actually putting more money to work in the Jordanian economy, I think is critically important in convincing others and almost paving the way for others. And the DFIs, quite honestly, I sit on the board of one. It's not, unfortunately, it doesn't work in Jordan yet, and that's unfortunate. And I'm not responsible for that, but I'm working on it. But I think the DFIs also want to be able to say that they're mobilizing other investors. So there's an alignment there of how do the DFIs step forward and then also pave the way and mobilize others. So let's really make sure we're keeping them front and center. I think in terms of the positioning of Jordan, frankly, the way we presented Jordan during the London investment, I think those talking points, those assets, the contributions, those are as relevant today as they were pre-COVID. Let's not forget everything we had pre-COVID. I think let's lift from that and then demonstrate, I would argue, because of the size, location, entrepreneurial spirit, hopefully agility of decision-making, you can get some things going faster than some other places can. And I think that speed of demonstration with tangible activity, if you can stand up a couple and showcase what Jordan is doing, absolutely. The sectors that you're strongest in, that people know you for, we talked about pharmaceuticals, we talked about garment, others. Sorry, I know we're out of time. You're waving me.
Yeah, and I'm being asked to wrap up. And we still have, by the way, a lot of beautiful questions. If it's okay with you, maybe I'll share those with you and we
Please.
can them online, offline. Yeah. We can listen to everybody. So Dana, Yasmin the Great, Shada, Mu'taz, Tariq, and Pablo, we will get your responses to your questions. Listen, Laurie, I just really want to thank you. I mean, you always fill our hearts here in Jordan. You're a very special part of all that we try to do. Thank you very much for taking the time to do this with all of us. Rasha and the team, thank you guys all for making it happen. I want to thank everybody who participated. The questions were absolutely brilliant. If we, in any way, shape, or form, contributed to one small crystallization that helps you move one step further, it would have all been more than worthwhile. Laurie, thank you. Good luck with Courageous Capital. And I guess we just sign off, right?
Thank you so much. It's really been a privilege. Thank you. Jordan continues to hold a very special place in my heart. So thank you for inviting me today.
We'll have you back soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye.